All right, let's dive into one of the most talked about, most debated issues, really, of our time, Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Got some really interesting stuff to go through today. We've got like a recent intelligence report, a super detailed timeline, even some study guide materials. Kind of feels like going back to school, but uh, hopefully a lot more interesting than that.
Definitely more interesting and important, too. I mean, you really can't understand what's happening in the world today, not just the Middle East, but globally, without understanding Iran's nuclear program. It's that big of a deal.
No question. So today we're going beyond just like the headlines. We're going to dig into like how did this program even start? What's driving it? And what does it all mean for us, here and now? Big question, right? Could Iran actually be on the verge of becoming a nuclear power? And if so, what does that even mean for the world?
It's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And to really grasp where things stand today, we got to go back, way back to the 1950s. You might be surprised to hear that Iran's nuclear program actually started with a partnership with, believe it or not, the United States. Wait, the U.S. and Iran working together on nuclear stuff back then? Seriously?
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
It was all part of President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. The focus was peaceful scientific research exploration. Iran even signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, in 1970. That's the treaty that aims to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So at first, Iran seemed committed to just peaceful nuclear tech.
And then boom, 1979, the Iranian Revolution, everything changes.
Exactly. Huge turning point. After the revolution, things went dark. Literally.
All right.
Iran's nuclear program basically went underground, super secretive. And that's when alarm bells started going off all over the international community. And it's still a huge problem, that lack of transparency.
Yeah, makes sense. Secrecy always makes people suspicious, right? But here's something interesting. Back in 1974, even before all that, Iran actually pushed for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East at the UN.
Right, and that kind of throws a wrench into the whole story, doesn't it? It seems like their main concern back then was Israel's nuclear program, which has never been officially acknowledged, let alone subjected to the same scrutiny as Iran. So you'd have this early push for a nuclear-free zone and then this turn towards secrecy. No wonder the world got suspicious.
So you've got this secretive program, a history of sending mixed messages. How did things escalate from there?
Well, the lack of transparency obviously drew more attention, especially between 2002 and 2012. That was a period of intense scrutiny. I mean, everyone was watching. International organizations, intelligence agencies, trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. A pivotal moment, I think, was in 2008. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, they issued this report, raised some significant questions. They put it like that, significant questions about whether Iran had conducted studies on weaponization in the past. They clarified some stuff about Iran's enrichment activities, but there was still a lot of unknowns, a lot of worry.
So no smoking gun, but enough to raise eyebrows. Were there any other red flags during that time?
Oh, yeah. 2012, the IAEA drops another bombshell. They find uranium particles enriched to 27% at Fordow, one of Iran's enrichment facilities. And that's a big deal because to get a nuclear weapon, you need uranium enriched to around 90%. Before this, the highest they'd seen in Iran was 20%. So that jumped to 27%. It was a huge wake-up call for everyone.
Getting closer and closer to that danger zone. I'm also curious about, this laptop evidence thing that came out around the same time.
Yeah, that was another curveball for sure. So U.S. officials, they handed the IAEA this info, supposedly from a laptop, and it was pretty damning stuff. Computer simulations, experimental data, all pointing to Iran trying to build a nuclear bomb. But here's the catch. It totally contradicted what U.S. intelligence had said just a few years earlier, back in 2009, when they claimed Iran had stopped that kind of work way back in 2003. So now you've got conflicting info, more distrust. It became even harder to figure out what was really going on.
More mystery, more suspicion. Okay, but let's step back for a second. The big question is, why is Iran so determined to go down this nuclear road in the first place?
That's where things get really interesting. It's not a simple answer, There are multiple layers to this. Understanding these motivations, it's key if we want to come up with any kind of effective policy. One factor we have to consider is strategic leverage. Think of it like a high-stakes bargaining chip in their dealings with the U.S. and other major powers.
So they're using their nuclear program to get something. But what exactly are they after?
Could be a lot of things. Sanctions relief, a boost to their economy. Maybe they want more say in regional politics, a bigger seat at the table. It's a way to flex their muscles on the world stage. But it's not just about leverage. There's also the deterrence angle to consider.
Deterrence, like having nukes to basically scare off any potential attackers.
Exactly. It's a scary logic, but it's a reality in international relations. And Iran might see nuclear weapons as the ultimate insurance policy against what they see as threats. And who are those threats? Well, the U.S. and Israel, obviously, given the history there, all the tension and animosity.
Don't mess with us or else kind of thing. But wouldn't developing nuclear weapons also be a risk for the Iranian regime? I mean, what about their own people? How do they balance that?
That's a great point. It's a double-edged sword. The nuclear program, it can definitely boost national pride, help the regime hold on to power. But, some people in Iran might see it as, like, reckless and dangerous, a waste of resources. So the regime, they have to walk a fine line, keep those internal dynamics in check while also playing their hand on the global stage. Not easy.
So it's a complex mix of strategic maneuvering, security worries, and internal politics all rolled into one. No wonder it's been such a tough nut to crack. And this all leads us to a pivotal moment. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the big nuclear deal signed in 2015, this was a huge effort. You had the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, China, France, Russia, the UK, the US, plus Germany, and of course the European Union, all involved in hammering out this agreement with Iran.
And the goal was ambitious, right? Limit Iran's nuclear activity in exchange for lifting all those international sanctions. The JCPOA had all these restrictions on Iran's uranium enrichment, how much enriched uranium they could stockpile, plus tons of monitoring by the IAEA. It was supposed to be like the ultimate roadblock to them getting a nuclear weapon.
Sounds pretty airtight. So why are we still talking about Iran's nuclear ambitions today? What happened to this supposedly grand solution?
Well, in geopolitics, nothing's ever simple. The JCPOA was controversial from the get-go. And then in 2018, under President Trump, the U.S. pulled out of the agreement. They slapped sanctions back on, claiming the deal wasn't tough enough, that it didn't address other stuff like Iran's ballistic missiles or their support for groups in other countries, which makes things unstable in the region.
The U.S. walks away, but the EU, they tried to salvage things to keep the JCPOA alive. How did that work out?
They were really invested in the JCPOA. The EU saw it as the best way to prevent, Iran going nuclear. So they tried to work around the U.S. sanctions, kept trading with Iran. They even created this thing called the blocking statute, which protected European companies doing business with Iran from U.S. penalties. But, even with all that effort, the U.S. pulling out really weakened the deal, made everything more tense.
It sounds like a tug of war between the U.S. and Europe, pulling in opposite directions. So, here we are, years later. What would happen if Iran actually gets a nuclear weapon? What are the global consequences? And what options are even left on the table for the rest of the world? So we were talking about the JCPOA, or lack thereof, and all the tension between Iran and the West. Let's get into it. What happens if Iran gets nukes? Seriously, what are the consequences for the rest of the world? Seems like everyone's kind of freaking out about it, and for good reason.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And the impact, it goes way beyond Iran's borders. It could change the whole world order, really.
Yeah.
The most immediate concern, I'd say, is what happens in the Middle East. I mean, the region is already a powder keg, right?
It's not exactly a peaceful paradise, that's for sure. I mean, I'm no expert, but even I can see how a nuclear-armed Iran would just make everything worse. What are the specific worries?
Well, you got to think about Iran's neighbors, right? Especially countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia, who see Iran as a direct threat. They've both been pretty clear that they see Iran's nuclear program as like an existential threat. They might feel like they have no choice but to take drastic measures to protect themselves.
So you're talking about a regional nuclear arms race, everyone's scrambling to get nukes to counter Iran's. Man, that's a scary thought.
Yeah, it's a classic case of what we call a security dilemma. Basically, when one country tries to beef up its security, it ends up making everyone else feel less secure. So they got to do the same, and it just spirals out of control. That's one of the scariest things about Iran getting nukes, the potential for this domino effect.
I mean, building nukes, that's not easy, right? It's super complex, expensive, and risky. Why would any country in the region think it's worth it?
You're right. It's a huge gamble. I mean, you risk international condemnation, sanctions, the whole 9 yards. But sometimes, fear just trumps logic. In a place like the Middle East, where everyone's got these long-standing rivalries and trust is basically non-existent, countries might feel like they have no other option. Like they have to match Iran's nuclear capability just to survive.
Man, that's terrifying. This idea of, nuclear proliferation. It could spread way beyond the Middle East, right? What would that do to the world?
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario. Decades of work to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons could just go up in smoke. The whole Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, would be seriously undermined. And then, who knows, maybe other countries with nuclear ambitions start thinking, hey, if Iran can do it, why can't we? That's a recipe for disaster. More nukes out there means a higher chance of accidents, miscalculations, or even, someone actually using them.
It's like something out of a Cold War movie, like a global nuclear apocalypse. Okay, so what can we do about it? What options does the world have?
That's the billion-dollar question. It's a tough one, and every option has its downsides. Diplomacy is always the best route, right?
Uh-huh.
But can we even get back to the negotiating table with Iran at this point? Is there any hope of reviving the JCPOA or maybe hammering out a new deal?
I mean, diplomacy first, for sure, especially when we're talking about nukes. But honestly, can that even work? There's so much bad blood between Iran and the West.
It's definitely a long shot. The trust is broken,
Yeah.
and any new deal would face a ton of scrutiny, especially in the U.S. There's a lot of pressure there to not give Iran an inch. They don't want to look weak. Plus, Iran's probably going to want more now after the U.S. walked out of the JCPOA. They might demand guarantees that the U.S. won't pull out again, and that's a tough promise for any U.S. president to make.
So diplomacy, maybe not impossible, but a real uphill battle. What about sanctions? Can we squeeze Iran economically hard enough to make them change course?
Sanctions have definitely hurt their economy, that's for sure. But sanctions alone, they rarely work. They have to be part of a bigger strategy. And there's a growing debate, about how effective they really are, especially now that China's gotten so chummy with Iran.
Yeah, China's been a big supporter of Iran lately. How does that change things?
Well, they've been basically undermining the West's sanctions, right?
Yeah.
Providing economic relief, maybe even helping Iran get their hands on some sensitive tech. For China, Iran's a valuable partner, helps them challenge the U.S. in the region. So, yeah, China's involvement makes everything a lot more complicated, makes sanctions less effective.
So sanctions alone, probably not going to cut it. And that brings us to, well, the more aggressive option, right? Military action. Is that even on the table?
Some people think force is the only way to deal with Iran, like it's the only language they understand.
Right.
But a military strike, hitting their nuclear facilities, that's incredibly dangerous. You're talking about potentially huge casualties, chaos in the region, retaliation against U.S. interests all over the world. It's the absolute last resort, something everyone wants to avoid.
So we're kind of stuck, aren't we? Diplomacy's tough, sanctions might not be enough, and a military strike is just, well, insane. Are we just going to sit here and watch Iran get closer and closer to having nukes?
It's a tough spot, no doubt. But I wouldn't say we're totally powerless. There are other things we can try, like focusing on verification and monitoring, making sure they're not cheating. That's always been a big problem with Iran, making sure they're sticking to the rules.
Yeah, but they've been so secretive. They've even tried to block IAEA inspectors from doing their jobs. How can we even be sure they're not hiding something?
That's why we need to give the IAEA more teeth, more resources, more power, better tech. That way they can catch Iran if they try to pull a fast one. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a start. At least it makes it harder for them to cheat.
So it's like, we got to play defense, make sure we can see what they're up to. But is there anything we can do proactively? Like, instead of just reacting to Iran, is there anything we can do to change the game?
One thing we could try, and it's often overlooked, is addressing the root causes. Why do countries want nukes in the first place? With Iran, it's partly because they feel threatened by the U.S., by Israel. It's a legitimate concern, and we can't just ignore it.
So instead of just yelling at them, we need to try to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. Doesn't mean giving in to their demands or anything, but we need to talk, explore ways to build trust, find common ground. It's a long-term strategy, but if we can create a more stable and secure Middle East, maybe Iran won't feel like they need nukes to survive.
So it's not just about Iran, it's about the whole region.
Right. The whole region is a mess, and we can't fix it overnight. But we can start by taking small steps, building trust, one brick at a time.
It's a tall order, that's for sure. But, I mean, the stakes are pretty high, right?
No doubt about it. This whole situation with Iran, it can feel pretty overwhelming, all the complexities. But the bottom line is, a nuclear-armed Iran, that's a really bad outcome for everyone. We got to stay focused, keep thinking outside the box, and never give up on finding a peaceful solution.
That's a good note to end on. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, for me at least. It's clear this issue is way more complicated than what you see in the headlines. Before we wrap up, though, any final thoughts? Like, Something our listeners can chew on, something to think about as we move forward into this uncertain future.
Yeah, here's something to ponder. With the JCPOA gone and tensions rising, what's next for Iran's nuclear program? And what role will the rest of the world play in all this? It's a tough question, no easy answers, but it's worth thinking about.
Okay, so back for the last part of our deep dive into Iran's nuclear situation, ambitions, whatever you want to call it. We've talked about a lot, right? Like, where did this whole thing begin? What could happen if Iran actually gets nukes? All the diplomacy and the drama. And of course, the big players, the US, Europe, China, all trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, a lot to process for sure.
Yeah.
But hopefully, our listeners, you guys, you're walking away with a better understanding of all this. It's complicated.
It is. I've definitely learned a lot. So as we wrap things up here, like, what are the main takeaways? What do we absolutely need to remember about all this?
Well, first off, Iran's nuclear program, it's not some static thing, It's been evolving for decades, man.
Yeah.
You've got history, geopolitics, all the internal politics in Iran, the limits of diplomacy. It's like this constantly moving target. Hard to predict what's going to happen next.
And the JCPOA falling apart, that was a big deal, right? Even though there was so much hope around it initially, it just shows how fragile these agreements can be. Like, all it takes is mistrust, a change in leadership, problems with verification, and boom, it's gone.
Exactly. But just because the JCPOA failed, it doesn't mean diplomacy's dead, right? It just means we got to get more creative, new ways to talk, even when we disagree. Get a region like Israel, Saudi Arabia, their concerns, they're real, they matter. We got to figure out how to address those through building more dialogue, things like that. They could help bring down the temperature, make things more stable.
It's all about trust, or some, right? Even if it feels like things are super tense.
Totally. I think ultimately this is serious stuff.
Yeah.
A nuclear armed Iran, that changes everything, not just in the middle of the whole. Focused on this, keep looking for solutions, and never, ever give up on trying to get out of this mess.
Couldn't always. Anything else? Like, one last thought for our listeners, something to think about as we, try to make sense of all this?
Yeah, I'd say this. What's the future of Iran's nuclear program now that the JCPOA is gone and things are so heated? What can the rest of the world do? Tough questions, but we got to keep asking them.
We do. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Hope you learned something. And more importantly, that you keep thinking about this really crucial issue.
Thanks for having me.